While Ford and Chevrolet were still struggling with consumers, a tough little automaker from South Bend, Indiana, was quietly rewriting the rules of American engines. Meet Studebaker, a company that built some of the most bizarre, brilliant, and downright eccentric engines in automotive history. From motors that seem borrowed from Cadillac to supercharged beasts capable of outrunning anything Detroit could muster, Studebaker's creations were never ordinary. Discover the strange and brilliant world of Studebaker engines, where every motor was a rebellion against the expected. Hit subscribe and catch up for the wildest automotive adventures yet. Studebaker beat everyone to the OHV V8 party. In 1951, little old Studebaker pulled off something wild. They brought out an overhead valve V8 before Ford or Chevy even had theirs on the road. An underdog beating the giants at their own game. While Ford and Chevrolet were still struggling with outdated flathead designs, Studebaker engineers were already stepping into the overhead valve era. And this wasn't just for show, it had real bite. The 232.6 cubic inch V8 first appeared in the Commander, producing 120 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. Doesn't sound like much today, right? But back in the early 50s, that was a big leap forward. This translated into real-world speed too. The Commander could push up to 93 miles per hour, about 150 kilometers an hour. For its time, that was a seriously quick machine. The Cadillac copy, that wasn't really a copy. Here's where things get a little complicated. For years, people have said Studebaker's 1951 V8 was just a copycat of Cadillac's overhead valve engine, which had already hit the market in 1949. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. At first glance, the two engines look almost the same, so much so that their intake manifolds are nearly interchangeable. But here's the catch. Studebaker didn't just copy Cadillac. Their V8 was designed by engineers Eugene Hardig, Stanwood Sparrow, T.A. Scherger, and their team. Sure, it ignored some of Cadillac's more advanced features, but that was on purpose. Studebaker stuck to safer, proven design choices, building an engine they knew would be reliable and practical. So while it looks like a Cadillac, calling it a straight copy really sells Studebaker's engineering short. Solid lifters. The noisy truth. Now, this is one of those unique characteristics that really sets Studebaker apart. From the very first V8 in 1951 all the way to the end of production in 1964, Studebaker never switched to hydraulic valve lifters like almost everyone else. Instead, they stayed with good old solid lifters. And if you owned one, you definitely knew it, because that meant frequent valve adjustments and a bit of extra clatter under the hood. Some drivers saw it as a hassle, but others thought of it as part of the car's personality. That rhythmic beat became the soundtrack of Studebaker ownership. The payoff? Rock-solid reliability. These engines could take a beating and just keep going. The physical oddities that made Studebaker unique. Big body, small displacement drama. Here's one of the oddest things Studebaker ever did with their V8. They built it huge. We're talking about a deck height over 10 inches and a bore spacing of 4.500 inches. That kind of layout gave the engine a footprint that looked like it belonged in a tank, not in a family car. But here's the deal. The very first version of that engine displaced only 232.6 cubic inches. That means it was nearly as big and heavy as Cadillac's 331 cubic inch powerhouse, but without the extra muscle to justify all that bulk. Imagine spending money on a giant moving truck just to haul one piece of furniture. It just didn't add up. Studebaker's design wasn't bad. It was just oddly inefficient. Old school pistons. Studebaker's V8 had a specificity that set it apart. It held onto full-skirt pistons long after the rest of Detroit had abandoned them. Now, full-skirt pistons were tough. They gave the engine stability and could handle a beating, which made sense if you wanted something rugged. The downside? They were heavy. That extra weight slowed down the rotating assembly, which meant throttle response wasn't as sharp, and the engine carried more mass than it really needed to. Plus, more surface area meant more friction, so efficiency took a hit. Meanwhile, Ford and Chevy had already moved to slipper pistons, lighter, quicker, and easier on fuel. Studebaker's choice did pay off for the high-performance stuff, like the supercharged Golden Hawk or the Avanti. But for everyday drivers, it added to the image that Studebaker's engines were tough, but old school, built to last, just not built to sip gas. The economy-first philosophy that defied conventions. Most American V8s were built to show off power, But Studebaker went the other way. Their engineers focused less on horsepower and more on fuel economy. In fact, the design notes mention fuel efficiency again and again, while performance barely got a mention. This wasn't about drag racing. The Studebaker V8 still had that smooth 8-cylinder feel, just without the gas-guzzling appetite of Detroit's big engines. It was practical engineering for everyday drivers. Sure, it didn't roar like a muscle car, but for folks who cared more about range and reliability than bragging rights, it was a smart choice. Tiny valves, big problems. Now here's where things got a little strange. The early Studebaker V8s were built with extremely small valves, just 1.28 inches for exhaust and 1.406 inches for intake. For comparison, most rival V8s of the time were running intake valves in the 1.6 to 1.9 inch range. That's a huge difference. The upside was snappy throttle response at low RPMs. The small valves meant air moved quickly at low speeds, so the cars felt lively off the line. But once the revs climbed, the engine simply couldn't breathe. It was like trying to run a marathon while sipping air through a straw. This wasn't just a small drawback, it was a built-in limitation. Throughout the entire production run of the Studebaker V8, no amount of tuning, carburetor swaps, or hot rodding could overcome the bottleneck. The valve size was baked into the engine's DNA, and it kept Studebaker's V8s from ever matching the high RPM performance of bigger-breathing V8s from Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler. Gears, not chains. Here's another curious Studebaker quirk. Unlike most engines of the era, the camshafts in early Studebaker V8s were driven by gears instead of the usual timing chains. On paper, it was brilliant. Gears meant more precise timing, less slippage, and improved mechanical efficiency. The engine could rev predictably without worrying about a stretched or broken chain throwing off valve timing. The downside? Noise. Gear-driven cams are louder than chains, producing a distinct whine that some drivers found quirky, others annoying. It wasn't a flaw, just a trade-off Studebaker embraced. Like the small valves we talked about, the gears gave the engine a unique character, efficient and precise at the cost of refinement. In short, Studebaker's engines marched to the beat of their own mechanical drummer. Adjustable compression, the engineer's dream. Studebaker's engineers had one clever trick up their sleeve that was years ahead of its time: adjustable compression ratios. And the way they pulled it off was surprisingly straightforward, by simply changing the piston deck heights. That meant the very same engine could run on cheap everyday pump gas, or with a quick swap, be tuned to handle high-octane racing fuel. The supercharger years, when Studebaker got serious. Factory superchargers before it was cool. Here's a wild one. Studebaker was installing superchargers onto their cars way before it was trendy. In 1957 and 58, the Golden Hawk came straight from the factory with a McCulloch supercharger under the hood. A few years later, Studebaker doubled down with Paxton superchargers on the Avanti and the high-performance Lark R-Series models. That's what makes this so remarkable. They were building true sleeper cars decades before the term even existed. While the rest of Detroit leaned on bigger engines, Studebaker proved that smart engineering and a little forced induction could give everyday cars real muscle. The perfect math: 289 cubic inches, 289 horsepower. It almost sounds like a made-up stat, but it's real. Studebaker's R2 supercharged V8 had 289 cubic inches of displacement and made exactly 289 horsepower. Not luck, pure engineering confidence. Back then, 1 horsepower per cubic inch was the ultimate standard, and Studebaker nailed it with their Paxton-blown V8. The R2 cranked out 289 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 332 pound-feet of torque at just 3,000 RPM. For comparison, many of Detroit's biggest names couldn't match those numbers. Studebaker pulled it off with style. Matching horsepower to displacement so perfectly wasn't just clever. It was a statement, and it secured the R2 a place as one of the most impressive feats in Studebaker's history. Never built for racing, always good for reliability. Here's the funny part. Studebaker never designed their V8s with racing in mind. They were built with reliability and efficiency as the top priorities. But surprisingly, that conservative approach made them tough as nails. And tough engines have a way of finding their way into competition. Andy Granatelli and his team tested Studebaker engines at the Bonneville Salt Flats, where cars are pushed to their absolute speed limits. What they found was surprising because Studebaker had overbuilt their engines for durability and longevity. Those same engines had hidden strength. With the right tuning, they weren't just reliable. They were fast enough to set speed records. That's why Studebaker engines kept going up in racing circles. They weren't advertised as performance monsters, but they had the guts to run with the best. Oil drain woes. Studebaker's V8 engines had one of the strangest oiling problems you'll ever hear about. Instead of keeping things balanced, these engines pumped way too much oil up top into the rocker arms and valve covers. The trouble was, the oil couldn't drain back to the crankcase fast enough. This left the bottom end starving for lubrication, while the top end was basically drowning. The weird part? Owners would change oil on schedule, yet still find themselves dealing with seized bearings or worn-out internals. For years, nobody knew why. Imagine being a mechanic back then, customers showing up, engines running dry, and no obvious cause. It wasn't until later that Studebaker finally addressed the issue, but by then, the damage to its reputation for quirky maintenance was already done. It's one of those engineering oddities that makes you shake your head and say, only Studebaker. The six-cylinder saga. Studebaker's six-cylinder story began in 1913 with the Model E engine. This wasn't your typical motor. It was built to last. At 288.6 cubic inches, it had oversized parts like huge bearings, 1-inch piston pins, and heavy-duty 4-bolt rods and mains. In simple terms, Studebaker made this thing like a tank. And they had to, because roads were rough and gasoline quality was terrible back then. The bore was 3.5 inches with a long 5-inch stroke, producing just 40 horsepower. That may sound tiny today, but in 1913 it was more than enough. The real strength wasn't speed, but toughness. People said it ran like a steam locomotive, steady, unstoppable, and built for the long haul. This wasn't just an engine for Studebaker. It was the beginning of a six-cylinder tradition that would last nearly 50 years. The chain-driven accessory shaft wonder. Here's a truly unusual bit of Studebaker engineering. Instead of using separate belt drives for each accessory, the early six-cylinder engines had a single chain-driven shaft that powered everything at once. The water pump, oil pump, generator, distributor, and even the cooling fan. On paper, it looked brilliant. One system neatly driving all the vital parts. No slipping belts, no clutter. But in the real world, it was kind of a nightmare. If that shaft or the chain itself had a problem, the whole engine was done for. One weak link, literally, and suddenly your water pump and oil pump both stop spinning. Not exactly the kind of thing you want happening miles from town in 1915. Still, you have to admire the creativity. The Rockne's electroplated pistons. Now this one's impressive. The Rockne model engines of the early 1930s came loaded with features most other car makers wouldn't use until much later. For starters, while many engines of that era relied on plain cast pistons that wore down quickly, Studebaker equipped the Rockne with electroplated pistons. Think of it as giving the pistons a hard protective armor coating. This made them last longer, resist wear, and handle more punishment without failing. But Studebaker didn't stop there. They used a silent chain cam drive instead of noisy gears, which made the engine run much more quietly. The crankshaft was dynamically balanced with counterweights, which reduced engine shake and improved durability. On top of that, a built-in vibration damper smoothed out the power delivery even further. It's one of those overlooked milestones that proves just how far ahead they were thinking, years if not decades before the rest of the auto industry caught up. The Skybolt 6, overhead valve revolution on a budget. In 1961, Studebaker faced a problem. Their old flathead 6 was ancient. Instead of spending a fortune on a brand new engine, they went the clever route, kind of like AMC had done, and reworked the one they already had. The result was the Skybolt 6. They took the 169.6 cubic inch straight head and converted it to an overhead valve design. Same displacement, but now it could breathe better with larger valves and improved manifolds. Horsepower jumped from 90 to 112, which was a big deal at the time. And here's the kicker. The whole thing stayed compact, only 30.5 inches long. It was Studebaker's way of looking modern without going broke. And while it wasn't exotic, it proved you didn't need a clean sheet design to keep up with the competition. The supercharger division that almost was. One of the weirdest twists in Studebaker history came in 1962, when the company actually bought Paxton products. If the name Paxton sounds familiar, it should, They were the people behind the Avanti's famous superchargers. With Paxton under their wing, Studebaker had something rare, their own in-house supercharger division. This wasn't just about the R2 engines everyone remembers. It opened the door to wild experiments, the R3, R4, and even the outrageous R5 setups, which pushed Studebaker engines into areas most people didn't expect from such a small automaker. By controlling development and production, they didn't have to rely on outside suppliers, which was pretty bold for a company struggling to stay alive. It gave us some of the most unusual and advanced performance packages of the early 60s, proving Studebaker wasn't afraid to chase speed, even while the rest of the company was falling apart. A land speed legacy that shattered records. If you think Studebaker was just about practical family cars, think again. In the early 1960s, the fiberglass-bodied Avanti with the R3 engine proved to be an absolute monster. We're talking about a legit 170 miles per hour, making it the fastest production car in America at the time. And no, that wasn't just a sales pitch. Those speeds were verified at the Bonneville Salt Flats, where Avantis went on to smash 29 world records. Imagine showing up with a car from South Bend, Indiana, and outrunning machines that cost twice as much. The sleek, aerodynamic body paired with Studebaker's supercharged V8 made it possible. For a brief moment, this quirky little company held bragging rights as the builder of the fastest car you could buy off a dealer's lot. Not bad for a brand most people thought was on its way out. The Canadian finale, when Chevrolet saved the day. Studebaker's ending was almost as strange as its peak moments. When U.S. production shut down in December 1963, that could have been the end. But the Canadian factory kept going for 2 more years. Here's the twist. They didn't even use Studebaker engines anymore. Instead, they borrowed power plants straight from Chevrolet. The 1965 to 1966 Studebakers ran on Chevy's 230 cubic inch 6 and the 283 cubic inch V8. On paper, it worked. The cars ran fine, but for a company that had prided itself on building its own engines for decades, it was kind of heartbreaking. The final Studebakers, were really just Studebaker bodies with GM guts, a strange hybrid, both functional and sad, because it meant the brand's proud engineering tradition had quietly slipped away. Studebaker's last stand was powered not by South Bend, but by Chevrolet, closing the chapter in a way nobody could have predicted. The weird legacy that influenced everything. Studebaker engines were never the strongest, rarely the most sophisticated, and certainly never the most popular. But they were consistently weird in the absolute best way. They innovated where others played it safe, stayed practical where others flaunted flash, and remained reliable where others faltered. These engines were the automotive equivalent of the brilliant kid in class who did everything differently and somehow made it work. From overhead valve V8s that beat Detroit to the punch, to supercharged beasts that rewrote the performance rulebook, to 6-cylinder workhorses that soldiered on for decades, Studebaker power plants were oddballs that achieved greatness through sheer engineering stubbornness. They proved that sometimes the weird way is the right way, and that true innovation doesn't always come from the biggest names in the game. Ever wondered what makes Studebaker engines so weird, and yet so brilliant? These weren't just engines, they were bold statements of engineering independence, defying conventions and proving that thinking differently could sometimes outsmart the giants. From quirky 6-cylinders to supercharged V8s that broke the rules, Studebaker left a legacy of toughness, innovation, and sheer mechanical audacity. If this dive into Studebaker's strange engineering blew your mind, hit subscribe to catch more automotive history gems. And don't forget to comment below. Which Studebaker fact surprised you the most?